This souvenir is very special. It's from the Holy Land. His mama then looked at him and said, "Son, you better appreciate it because it's so far away, we will never go there." Well, the little boy, a little bit later, he was telling his friend about it. He said, this came from heaven, and that's a place where my family will never go. Do you feel like it's impossible for your family to get to heaven? What does God expect from you and your family tonight? When I read the book of Hebrews, I really find this phrase that's mentioned over and over that I want to share with you tonight. And what I did is I read through the book this week, and I kept finding this idea come up over and over again. And I thought, you know what, that's a sermon right there. I've got to start preparing this sermon, so I hope that in 2019 this will help to be included in our theme that we're going to discuss this year about the word focus. Now, you may remember when I first came here, I tried to give a 5-year plan. And so far, we've discussed all these subjects, and all of our sermons each year surrounded each of these subjects. And our theme for this year is, of course, the focus that you and I have. So tonight, that's kind of the idea. I want us to go to the book of Hebrews, and I hope tonight to stay in this book. I want to notice just as many passages as we can to deal with our subject tonight right here in the book of Hebrews. So let's begin in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, and I want to give you the theme of the book tonight. If you were to attach a theme to this book, it would certainly be this idea. He says, "Take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart and unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." The idea of this book is faithfulness. You're going to find this idea and the certain phrases attached with that idea over and over again. For instance, I'll give you a few more. You could write this in your margin right next to chapter 3. In chapter 10, in verse 38, he said, "Now the just shall live by faith. But if any man will draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. And we are not of them that draw back unto perdition, but are them that believe unto the saving of the soul." All the way to the finish line is the idea of this book, being faithful. So we come to our text tonight. It's Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. And you see this idea once again. I'm going to focus on one word here in this verse. Notice, he said, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us." Notice, "and let us run with patience." Now, if it were my Bible, I would just underline that word patience. I did a little word study, and I want to share it with you. I have 2 books that are some of the most valuable tools that I use. One of them is if you look up a word, it's numbered just like in your Strong's Concordance. But what it'll do for you is it will give you every time that word is translated and how it's translated. So in some places, it will be translated a little bit differently. Now, when I looked at this word, it was only translated differently one other time. Enduring. So I decided, all right, I'm going to go a little further. Look at this other book. It's a word study book that gives you the background of a word. So I looked it up. Here's the definition. It says, to remain under, to endure, to be constant, to have patient continuance. Literally, when you break down, it's 2 words in the original. They're slammed together. It literally means under, remain. So when the Greek guy is reading this, he literally reads this, run with remaining under. How does that happen? To be a rock is the idea, to remain faithful in that race. And that's what we want to talk about tonight, which is literally the theme of the book. I'm reminded of this poem, and I want to share it with you tonight. A friend is not a friend unless he's a friend unto the end. So we don't want to claim to be the friend of God and then show many to be a fraud. God never expected perfection, but has always expected a deep connection. If we fall short, it won't be our last, but always remember that we must remain steadfast. So we do not have to win first place. All He expects for us is to finish the race. Friend, that's our lesson for tonight. In 2019, we want to talk about this idea of focus, and we want to remain faithful to God in 2019. So I hope this lesson will help you. I hope this will be riveted upon our lives and hearts tonight. I want to give you 4 things from this book, specifically in the book of Hebrews. Number 1, God expects me to be faithful in word. He expects me to be faithful in work. He expects me to be faithful in worship. He expects me to be faithful in willingness. And all of these things are found right here in this book. So let's begin. Number 1, I want us to go to Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 14. And we're going to find this idea twice. Okay? There was a grandmother, and she took her granddaughter to the zoo. And at the zoo, they would paint the faces of little children. But this little girl, she had freckles all over her face. And she told the lady that was painting her face, she said, "I'm sorry that I have so many freckles on my face." And Grandma, she wasn't going to have that. She said, "Let me tell you something about freckles." She said, "Freckles are the most beautiful things in the world." That little girl said, "I know something that's more beautiful than freckles." Grandma said, "No." She said, "Wrinkles." That was the sweetest thing she could have said to Grandma. She didn't really mean necessarily that the wrinkles are beautiful. What she's saying is, you are beautiful. That's what she's really saying deep down inside. And I want to tell you today that if you are faithful to God, do you know what you are telling Him? I appreciate what you have done for me. You are special to me. But if I'm unfaithful to God, do you know what it says? I don't really appreciate what you have done. So I hope that will be our focus tonight when you think about these 4 things. Number 1, let's talk about God expects me to be faithful in word, okay? Notice in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 23, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you several times this word is found, specifically twice, but this is a little bit extra, okay? So if you want to write this in your margin, you can. But he said, "Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promised." So when I ask the question tonight, how fast are you? I'm not talking about how quickly you run. And the Bible is not asking the question, how quickly are you when you run the race? What you're going to find is phrases like hold fast and steadfast. So when I see this, here's what I ask myself. How steadfast am I? How do I have the ability to hold fast according to what God has taught me? And he said, first of all, I have to hold fast to my profession. You find this in chapter 4 and verse 14 also. If you remember, I told you to turn there just a minute ago. He said, "Seeing that we have a great high priest who is passed into the heavens, Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Notice, let us hold fast our profession. You'll find this also in another book, and you could turn there if you would like, but I'm going to notice it quickly. What I would do is write it in the margin, but I found this. I did another little word study, and I wanted to share it with you. You find this same word also in 1 Timothy chapter 6, when he said, "Fight the good fight of faith, and lay hold on eternal life, whereunto thou art also called, and thou hast," notice, "professed a good profession among many witnesses." But in the very next verse, it's the same Greek word, the same original word, and it's translated confession. So let's put all this together then. God expects me to be faithful in word. What does he mean? If I say it, then I have to portray it. I heard this one time. It's probably not politically correct, but it says, if you spew it, you have to do it. All right? That's how I think of it in my mind. God says, okay, if you say you are a Christian, then I expect you to be faithful. Well, tonight, that's sort of the idea of the book of Hebrews. You'll find this same word again in a familiar passage. This passage is probably very, very familiar to you. In Romans chapter 10 and verse 10, he said, "With the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation." 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14, he said, "Let us hold fast the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promised." So let's put all this together then. God expects me to be faithful in word. What does he mean? If I say it, then I have to portray it. I have to There was a man, he wanted to buy an anniversary gift for his wife. So he went and he looked at some perfumes, He thought, that's what I'll do. Most women like perfume. So he said, how much is this? The guy behind the counter told him it was $150. His jaw about hit the floor. He was a real cheap man. He said, no, I can't spend $150 on an anniversary gift. He said, that is a no way. You got a smaller bottle? The guy said, sure, yeah, we do. We have a smaller bottle, and it's $50. He said, that's too much. He said, 150, now 50. He said, I just can't do that. That's just too much money. Do you have anything cheaper? The guy behind the counter handed him a mirror. He was smart, wasn't he? He was cheap. Something I learned about God's work, it's not cheap to God. You can't put limitations on God's work. It's worth the entire world. Jesus said, if any man is profited if he gain the whole world, he will lose his own soul. Or he said, well, what man is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? He doesn't profit anything if he gains the whole world. That tells me that one soul is more valuable than the entire world. So I've got to ask myself, here's how I take this home. You say, preacher, how do I take this home tonight? And here's what I do. I look at this and I say, you know what? How do I cheapen the work of God? Friend, if I say I'm a Christian, then I want to be involved. I want to be a Christian. And tonight, if you say that you are a Christian, God is expecting us to live up to the name that we are called by every single day. Number 2, that leads me to the next point. How fast are you in your work? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 10. And sort of what I've done is, if you may remember, I started in chapter 10 under the first point, okay? So what we're going to do is we're just going to work our way down in chapter 10 just for these several points, but we're also going to look at other passages in the book of Hebrews. So this one he says, be faithful in word, your profession. But then you come to verse 24 of chapter 10, and he says, be faithful also in your work, because he said, let us consider one another to provoke and to love and what? Well, good works. The more that I'm reading and learning, and I tell you, I've got so much to learn all the time, and the Bible is like going out to the ocean with a spoon, I see this idea more and more as a Christian. We are responsible for fulfilling God's work. God doesn't expect you to break your arm, but He expects you to use your arm. There's some things that Christians have to do, and that's the idea is if He expects us to be called a Christian, then He expects us to live up to the name. Let's go to chapter 4. I want to give you 3 more verses under this point. I'm reminded of a golfer. He hit a golf ball, but he sliced the ball really, really hard, and it broke a window in a Volkswagen, and the Volkswagen hit another car, and that other car hit a bus. So him and his friend are standing there, when he hit the golf ball, they both went, uh-oh. So his friend asked him, he said, what are you going to do now? He thought for a second, he said, well, I think this time I'll straighten up my arm and keep my head down. Well, by that time, he's in a load of trouble, At least he's trying to do it right. There's something that I see about people in this room, and I hope you see the same in me. None of us in this room are perfect. We've all got different personalities, but I hope that we all have at least one thing in common. At least we're trying to get it right. And I think that's why you're here. The reason why you're here tonight is because you're saying to God, I want to be as faithful as I possibly can. So tonight, let's challenge ourselves a little bit. Let's ask ourselves in 2019, what is it that I can do specifically for a ministry in God's kingdom? You look here in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 11. He continues this idea in this book, and he said, He said also, let us labor therefore to enter into His rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. The rest doesn't come until the day of judgment comes. You come to chapter 6 and verse 10. If you just go over 2 chapters, and I love this part, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book because he describes how God is still mindful of the things that you do. He said, God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love which you have showed toward his name, in that you minister to the saints and do minister. God expects us to do it, but I love this, that he is mindful of it. He said, look, I'm taking a record of all of this. I'll give you one more. Let's go to the end of the book, chapter 13, and look at verse 21. He concludes this book with this same idea in mind. Now, I know you're like, well, wait a minute. Just give me a central theme. These people are falling away from God, and you know what he's doing? He's giving them ways to make sure that they don't fall away. So if I say it, then I'll do it. If I'm doing it, then I will keep doing it, is the idea. Notice how he concludes chapter 13, verse 21. That he make you perfect in every good work, to do his will according in you that which is well-pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. Friend, I hope you're seeing a continual idea throughout this book. How fast are you in word? How fast are you in work? How fast are you in worship? You know, I'm excited for you tonight because I see a lot more people in this room tonight than I have seen in a while on Sunday night. You know what that tells me? You are smart. It also tells me that you are faithful. It also tells me that you are not afraid to do what God says for you to do. And you understand that this morning's sermon, if there was any time that you needed to hear something, it probably would have been this morning. And you said, you know what, I'm going to listen to God. It's not just because Cody was preaching. It's not just because I'm preaching. You said in your heart, no, that's what God told me to do, and I'm going to go back and be there tonight. And I want to tell you, friend, you ought to be commended for that. The Bible describes what fools are like in the book of Proverbs, and you know who they are. They're people who don't listen. And you have done the opposite of that. You're very wise for that, and you ought to be commended. Let's notice our next one. Let's go back to chapter 10. In chapter 10, verse 23, he says, be faithful in word. He called it a profession. In chapter 10 and verse 24, he said, be faithful in a work, and he called it a good work. But then in chapter 10 and verse 25, he said, be faithful in worship, and he called it the assembly. You'll notice, he said, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, even so much the more, as you see the day approaching. I'm reminded of a doctor and an engineer and a politician, and they were arguing, of course, which profession was the oldest. The doctor, he said, look, mankind would not have been able to survive without doctors. Doctors are the oldest profession that we know. Well, at any rate, the engineer, he said, look, you couldn't build things without engineers, and even the Bible in the beginning talks about those who built things, the Tower of Babel. That's the oldest profession. Well, the politician, he said, look, with all the chaos that's been going on since the beginning of time, he said, let me tell you something. Adam was a politician. And politicians were the first. Well, then somebody looked at him and said, well, look, it may be the oldest because I think you're the ones who caused all the chaos to begin with. You know what's wrong with our politicians in the United States today? One thing. If they are wrong, it's because they're not faithful to God. Now for you, you're going to have to decide which one that is, and I'd have to decide which one I believe is doing the will of the Lord or trying his best to do so. But I will tell you today, after I saw a law that was passed in New York that further allowed babies to be murdered in their mother's wombs, I would say we've got a lot of work to do as far as politicians are concerned. It's terrible. You say, well, abortion was already legal. I know. That's why we've been in trouble for a long time. I'll be honest with you tonight. I don't think God is going to overlook things like that. You know, the Bible teaches there are some things that God winked at. In Acts chapter 17, he said, at the times of this ignorance, God winked at, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. I don't think God is going to overlook something like that. Our politicians, friend, are getting further and further away from God. And I believe it's because there is a lack of seriousness for worshiping God. Think about this. You know, when 9/11 took place, how many of you in this room, just curious, how many of you remember exactly where you were when the Twin Towers were hit? I still remember that very vividly, even today. I was very far away from God at that time, but I still remember where I was. And I thought it was interesting. Even as myself, I was a heathen of heathens. And I saw all those people on the White House lawn holding hands and praying, and I heard the politicians saying, Lord, help our country. I thought, oh, get out of here. That's exactly what I thought. And I wasn't even a child of God. I knew better. You know, I'm sad to say, I think that woke up some people, but not for a long time. The worship needs to get back in order. And I want to tell you, if I ever become faithful, friend, I want you to come get me. Help me understand that the most important responsibility I have is to worship God, number one. And I want to tell you tonight, if you are ever questioned about whether or not you feel you're faithful, all you got to do is ask yourself this question: do I worship God like I'm supposed to? And if not, friend, things will begin to dwindle. But if you do, it will begin to fall right into place. Let me give you some more scriptures along this line. And then I'm going to move on to my last point. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, I'll notice this one and move on. Jesus talked to the Pharisees and he said, this people draws nigh unto me with their lips, and they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. It's amazing how he's looking them right in the face. And he said, look, you say you want to be religious, but you're not worshiping. In fact, he said they do it vainly because they teach for doctrines of commandments of men. Number 4 and finally, God is asking me in this book, are you faithful, Josh McCrary? Are you faithful in word when you say you are a Christian? Are you faithful in work when you say that you're going to do this or do that for the Christian work? Are you faithful in worship? And then he asked me, last of all, and us tonight, am I faithful in my willingness? I want us to go to chapter 3. There are 3 scriptures I want to notice tonight before we close. And I want to focus on this idea because what we've been seeing over and over are the words hold fast and steadfast. But I like this part because he attaches something to it that already should be understood. In chapter 3 and verse 14, he said, we are made partakers of Christ if we hold fast. There it is. Now, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast, notice, unto the end. Now, unto the end should already be understood, but I love how he includes that in there. He said, don't miss this one. We've got to keep on keeping on with our willingness. I'll give you another one. Chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. He said, as Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which would be spoken after, but Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast, there it is again, the confidence and rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end. There was a young man. He was about 17, so he sort of developed this idea that if he was going to live in his father's house, then he wasn't going to listen to his daddy anymore. They lived on a farm. He had to feed the cows, feed the horses, milk the cows, take care of the chickens, cut the hay, bale the hay. And his life, he felt like, was a vicious cycle. And he thought, you know what? I'm sick of this. So his daddy told him one day, he said, son, I cut down a tree yesterday. I need you to go out there and I need you to take the chainsaw, finish cutting the tree up, load up the firewood, and bring it back to the house, and me and you will stack it together. He said, it jumped all over him. He's throwing wood, he's out there, he's so upset. And finally, he got so upset, he left. He didn't come back for 2 days. He got out there and he realized he didn't have no food. He was cold, didn't have any clean clothes. So he came moping on back home. His daddy met him out the front door and he said, "Son, I've been waiting on you to come back. I've been sick. Your mama has been sick, worried about you." They hugged. He fed him dinner. He let him take a shower and all that. And it was dark by that time. But you know what his daddy did? He called him in the living room and he sat him down and he said, "Son, I want you to understand that there are responsibilities in life, and if you're going to live in this house, you're going to have to learn the responsibilities that you have in this house. So I want you to go outside and I want you to go get that wood and bring it home." He learned something for the rest of his life because of that lesson right there. If he was going to be called by his daddy's name and he was going to live in that house, he was not going to get away with not doing what his father said. Did he become a good adult? You better believe he did. He was very successful. Raised faithful children in the Lord because his father wasn't going to let him get away with it. There was one statement that I never heard, but I agreed with this morning that Cody said. He said one of the major problems that we have in the church today is apathy. I sort of thought about that before, but I never just really put it together. That makes a lot of sense. Not just here in Ripley, we're talking about worldwide. What about the congregation that meets, in different towns that has 25 members and they had 25 members for 40 years? Why is that? Apathy. They have forgotten their willingness, the responsibility that they have as Christians. I'm going to close with this idea. In Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 12, he said, "We desire that every one of you show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope." Here it is, "unto the end. And be not slothful," he said, "but followers of them through faith and patience, they inherit the promises." Earlier he said that after you've done the will of God, you inherit the promise. Friend, this book is very powerful because it's written to people who are becoming unfaithful. So if you ever think, am I that person? Ask yourself. If you say it, are you professing it? Are you faithful in word? Are you faithful in work? Are you faithful in worship? Are you faithful in willingness? Because I'm going to tell you something that happens when you are. This is my last, and I'm going to end with this. God will always be faithful in his welcome. All those 4 W's lead to this last W, which is the welcome. And you read about this in chapter 6 and verse 19. And he said, "We have a hope that is like the anchor of the soul." Notice, it is both sure, and here's our word, steadfast. All of those holding fast and the steadfast, they lead to this steadfast, which God says, "I will never leave you anchorless." I love that idea. Tonight, friend, I beg of you to think about 2019. Not too long ago, I had to sit down and think about goals that I need to set in 2019, not only for myself, but for my family. We have decided we want to have devotionals as a family. I want to have devotionals for myself. My wife, she's begun to set goals for herself in reading the Bible. And I want to tell you, friend, that's what it's all about. Because I have learned in my short time preaching, if I don't set those goals, do you know what's happening? I'm going backwards. We've got to set goals to help us move forward. Will you receive it tonight? I hope that you will. And I hope that you Again, to examine in 2019 and say, yes, it's time for us to go forward. If you've never obeyed the gospel, why would you not begin your race tonight? It's the best race you'll ever run. If you obey the gospel tonight by believing and repenting of your sins, confessing the name of Christ, and being baptized into the family of God, and being faithful to Him, God says, you've won the race. Will you come tonight, right now, as we stand, as we sing?